later on we will post on YouTube channel. Is it fine with you?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, let's get started. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today's faculty seminar series. And this is our last talk. And I would like to take this opportunity and to thank the team member, Dr. Kathleen Kiwani and Mrs. Jing Liu, for organizing the event and contacting the speaker and also moderating the talks. And would like to thank also Dr. Chris Kotler for providing this opportunity. And our administrative staff, I would like to thank you them, like the Mary Lynch, Silly, Krista, Mandy, and Teresa, for promoting the talk. And for today, we have Tom Lyncheston from Nature Conservancy of Canada. And I know Tom for about maybe 10 years or more. And I had the privilege to work with Tom on Livestock Gentech, University of Alberta. Tom was and is ranger and still goes back to the ranch sometime. And besides this one, Tom had different role with industry, including advisory board for Sustainable Beef Roundtable. And he has a passion for sustainability. So then today, Tom will talk about the role of cattle on sustainability and biodiversity. So then, but today it will be more question answering after watching the video. So then I encourage you to take down your question, then at the end ask Tom those questions and we can have a really productive question and answering period. Without any further ado, just Tom, please go ahead and introduce yourself. And at the time that let me know when I'm supposed to play that video. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Gatter. And pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. And hello to everyone. I'm assuming everyone is probably still at home, maybe in various parts of the country, even though this is based in Dalhousie, right, Gatter?
Yes.
Yeah. And so good to see you. I'm calling from Edmonton, Alberta. This is where I make my home now. But as Gatter said, I'll introduce myself quickly and then I'll go into the video, introduce the video that we're going to show, and then we'll have a good discussion after. And so for those of you, as Gatter mentioned, I grew up in southern Alberta in the foothills. This picture behind me, the banner that I have, is actually it's near Waterton National Park, just outside the park onto the grasslands. And the ranch that I grew up on, our family ranch, looks very similar to this. So rolling foothills right at the base of the Rockies. Mostly native grasslands, and our ranch where I grew up it's a fourth generation ranch. My grandfather started it in the late 1800s, and now my brother is running the ranch. And I used to do that before I moved to Edmonton to work at the University of Alberta, and that's where I met Gatter in Livestock Gentech. So you know, of course, you know, growing up on a ranch, raising beef cattle, that was our main business. You do learn a lot about how to work with nature, why resilient and healthy nature is important. And that's probably started my foundation of my interest in what sustainability actually is and what raising a sustainable product actually looks like. And sustainability isn't just about environmental benefits. It also ties into economics and as well as social concerns, such as animal welfare, if you're talking about the beef industry, or even the well-being of people and our own mental and physical well-being. And so those three pillars, environment, social, and economics, are all very much tied in together. And one thing that I learned while growing up and even working on the ranch, and I worked on the ranch for 13 years with my brother. you realize how important taking proper care of your main resource, which is not cattle, it's healthy grassland and water. Taking care of that really is important to your bottom line as a business, and also important to your own well-being as a person, and the pride you get out of ensuring that the small piece of the environment that you're taking care of is well cared for, that it's healthy. And we have on our ranch, and after this presentation, I might show you a few pictures of our place. We have tons of different wildlife out there. So elk, deer, grizzly bears, black bears. We even have some wolves come through, cougars, many birds, grouse, etc. We've got some lekking sites on the ranch. And one thing that I also learned is not only you're worried about your family business, but you also look at biodiversity as an indicator that you're actually doing something right. And it is really quite, you get a lot of pride when you do see an abundance of wildlife. And when that wildlife is there, also enjoying the landscape, you're actually probably doing a good job at managing that landscape well. Because if you weren't, either your business would fail, you wouldn't have wildlife hanging out on your ranch. And so all those things are very much tied in together. My experience growing up as in the country on a ranch did eventually lead me to where I am right now, which is with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And you may be thinking, well, how does conservation and beef cattle production, how do they fit together? And as I said, one thing that we've learned growing up as a rancher is that you can't have a viable business, you can't feel good as a human being if you don't have a healthy environment at the same time. Now, from the Nature Conservancy of Canada, what is our interest in cattle ranching? And this is where the film will really come in and maybe provoke some thoughts and questions from all of you. One of the perceptions is that cattle and beef are ruining our planet. And while there's certainly impacts that need to be mitigated and improved, there are benefits out there as well. And so when we're thinking about sustainable food production, we have to think within the context of where we live, the landscape we have. And one of the problems we have in Canada is that we are losing still native grassland throughout the temperate Great Plains, both in Canada and the US. And that main loss is due to cultivation, also due to industrial development or urban development, but the main loss is due to cultivation. We only have about 25% of our native grasslands left. So it is a threatened ecosystem. And that is leading to why Nature Conservancy tries to work with ranchers, especially other livestock owners, to help hopefully give them a little bit of a boost, a little bit of an economic incentive to stay on the landscape stewarding the land. So why don't right now we go into the video. It's about 12 minutes long. Try and sit back. When we do it over Zoom, it does get a bit choppy, so you can watch it on YouTube afterwards for a little bit more flow. And hopefully this will work, and then we'll have a good discussion after.
Yeah, okay. Just one more thing to add, Tom. I was trying to promote the talk through LinkedIn, and I was looking for some stats. So then I saw that 70% of Canadian grassland already gone, and 60 species that we have, they're at risk in these grasslands. So then it's a good just to give some such a stat and see what would be the role of cattle in conserving those species. Okay, so then I'm playing, I'm playing the video. Then after that, we can have discussion in this.
Walk down the street and ask any Canadian to name the world's most endangered ecosystem. Chances are they'll say either the rainforests or the coral reefs. These two ecological hotspots are the focus of international campaigns to protect biodiversity.
Well, the international community has been making its opinion clear.
They're the subject of social awareness campaigns through the news and social media. As you walk down grocery aisles, you'll see products with logos about protecting marine life or rainforests. And chances are your favorite restaurant has started offering paper straws. There's no denying the impact we are having on the planet. And with all this increased awareness, you may be surprised to find out that one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world is actually one we have right here in Canada.
Here in Western Canada, we have less than 20% of our native grasses left. In some areas, that number is as low as 13%, which is really sad because you think of the cultural significance that these grasslands have for Western Canada, first the Indigenous peoples, and then the settlers that came out. Everybody talked about the prairies as being a vast inland sea of grass. And honestly, if you've ever had the opportunity to spend an afternoon in a grassland when the wind is blowing and you hear it swishing, you would think that you're in a sea. But it's disappearing, and it's disappearing at a real alarming rate.
The loss of Canada's native grasslands is also a loss for the world. Humans depend on nature for our very survival, and the loss of grasslands creates major environmental issues such as flooding, loss of wildlife habitat, and a reduction in soil carbon sequestration.
In healthy native grass, there can be over 100 different plant species within a 5-acre radius. Not only are there plants, but there's a lot of different wildlife.
There's more than 80% of Canada's species at risk that depend on grasslands. By losing our grasslands, it's actually going to be extremely impactful on the majority of our endangered species.
Basically with grass, what they say is that you've got what you have above ground, you also have below ground. So if you have grass that looks like this above ground, then you also have roots that look like this below ground. But with native prairies, it's like threefold, where the roots really extend deep into the soil. The benefit of that is there's two cycles of carbon, and the above ground stuff every year in the spring, like right now, it's sucking carbon from the air and producing plant matter above ground and below. But all the stuff above ground gets cycled back into the air again within, usually by the end of the summer, or for sure by the next year. The stuff that goes into the ground is the roots, and that stuff's what becomes really stable and long-lasting in the soil. And that's how they build organic matter here. So this ranch is 65,000 acres, and it sequesters, currently right now, there are approximately 2 million tons of carbon, which is the equivalent to the emissions from over 100,000 Canadians for a year. So that is stable, long-term, and permanent in the ground as long as we have an intact ecosystem and cattle grazing on it.
Over the last decade, the story of cows and the environment has been a hot topic, but the narrative has been focused on cattle's contribution to climate change and the destruction of the rainforest. The idea that cattle could be integral to the health of an ecosystem is a very different story. In order to understand the real impact of cattle on a specific ecosystem, we have to look at the context.
The context is so important. We're not standing in a rainforest. We're standing on the Canadian prairie. And so in that context, we need grazers, and we need a livestock industry to keep the prairie, what's precious left of it, where it is. And so in our Canadian context, let's think about what's most sustainable for here.
So what role do cattle play in the grasslands ecosystem?
What happens is the glaciers came and wiped off all the topsoil, so we had no life. There was nothing here, and it grew topsoil down into the soil. I always thought that topsoil grew up and it was an accumulation of something, but topsoil actually grows down into the dirt, and it's just a conversion of inorganic dead rock and silt and sand into actually this dark black life, which is like an Amazon rainforest but underground, where you have little tiny T-Rex predators, and they're going around and killing other things, and prey animals and parasites, and it's a whole complex web underground, an ecosystem that's alive. And by having cattle here, they're creating that life. They're the keystone species in this ecosystem. It was the bison before them, and the bison completely built this into the ecosystem that we have today and built all the topsoil and sequestered all the carbon. And when they disappeared, these grasslands became sick, and they needed to have another keystone large herbivore grazing on it.
When a keystone species is removed from a habitat, all other species are affected, and some may disappear from that ecosystem or even become extinct. Without the presence of a grazing species on the grasslands, there's a devastating impact on the natural production cycle of the grass.
In the fall, that top growth dies and the root underneath the soil stays growing. But because the top growth has died, if it's not grazed and removed, what happens in the spring is it gets harder for the new growth to grow up through it. So the grass actually ends up starting to smother itself and all of the other species around it. So really, you need to have the grazers on there that are helping to remove and eat off some of that growth so that it can start regrowing again in the spring.
Without ranchers to keep these wide open spaces intact, we wouldn't have these amazing iconic landscapes. The families that own these ranches, it's been in their family for generations. They genuinely care about the land. And there's a really direct correlation between healthy land and healthy cows. Ranchers know that if they take care of the land, it's going to benefit, the whole cattle production industry. And so there's this really symbiotic relationship between cows and native grassland.
There's no better example of this than the story of the Grasslands National Park. Parks Canada, in hopes of preserving the prairie land and saving it from being plowed and turned into cropland, had their own ideas in 1988 about what would be good for the grass, and that did not include grazing. This created friction between Parks Canada and the local ranchers, who argued that grazing and disturbance were critical to healthy native prairie. For 20 years, much of the grass lay idle, grazed only occasionally by wandering wildlife. So what happened after removing cattle from native grasslands? The grasslands lost its biodiversity, and tame species of grasses such as crested wheatgrass began to take over. This also impacted wildflowers, pollinators, and the homes of birds that nest in the native grasses. Fortunately, Parks Canada listened. They researched and worked closely with Saskatchewan ranchers, conservationists, and scientists to bring cattle back to the national park in order to benefit native birds and other species.
We need that grazing impact. So when we think about the grass that we see here, when we have a grazer come along and bite those plants and create an interesting and dynamic canopy structure in that grass, that creates homes and types of homes for all kinds of birds and all kinds of other animals, and lets light down to the soil surface to let different types of plants grow and compete, and all of those things add to the biodiversity and these bio-rich communities that we have.
There's deer and elk and grizzly bears and worms and all sorts of things in here. And if you were to cultivate this and grow lettuce, you would have to get rid of all of those other things, whereas cattle just share the ecosystem. They don't use it completely. They just share it with everything else. And that's what's really special, is that cattle are able to be a part of the ecosystem without damaging it, but actually to benefit it.
While the native pretty tough ecosystem, it can survive a lot. The one thing it can't survive is being broken up. When the native prairie is plowed or tilled or converted for other uses, even if it's only used under those different uses for 5 or 10 years and then seeded right back down to grass, it never comes back in this part of the world as true native prairie.
When the Canadian prairies were settled, a large portion of the native grasslands were lost to the development of cities and towns, construction of highways, and the plowing of land for growing crops and other uses. With 74% of Canada's native grasslands now lost forever, preserving what's left is critical. Working with ranchers to help manage the grasslands by using domesticated livestock to graze the land that bison roamed for thousands of years may be able to preserve this precious resource for future generations. Right now, we have a choice, but if we wait until it's gone, there won't be a choice left to make.
I heard a quote once, and it talked about the extinction of a species. And it's a very, very powerful quote because it said, is a species extinct when there are no longer any species left on the planet? Or are they extinct when there are so few that can't hear each other calling to each other? So could you imagine that? Being an animal that calls this place home, and there's so few spaces left that you can survive, that you can't hear any of your mates calling. So, you know, the thing is being in conservation, you kind of have to be an eternal optimist, and I'm very optimistic, and I really think that these are beautiful landscapes. They provide so much to humans, and I think we've all come to a spot in our civilization where we're starting to realize that we depend on nature, and we really have to live in symbiosis with it. So I really think that there's a lot of hope for these grasslands, that if enough people start to care about them, we'll never have to wonder if they go extinct or not.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, Connor's still got his screen going.
Oh,
Welcome, everybody.
okay.
There we go. So, yeah, so I mean, that video was, it was actually developed. I'll just give a bit of background on it, if that's okay. Before I had this role with Nature Conservancy Canada, I used to work for Alberta Beef Producers. They're an industry nonprofit organization. And they were asked at the time by the Waldron Ranch, and my family actually, our ranch is just south of the Waldron. So that's kind of the area that, you know, where I grew up. So again, it's very dear to me. But they were asked to do a video. They were trying to do just a historic video on the Waldron Ranch, mainly for people. There's a highway that goes through there, so that people could just get a bit of history of what was going on the ranch. And the filmmakers that were hired, as they were interviewing ranchers and conservation groups and everything, started to go, wait a second, there's a story here that doesn't really get told very often. And it's an important story. So that film has won quite a few awards across Canada and internationally. It's quite interesting, but I thought it would be good context to bring something to light about sustainability. And now I think we could go take some questions if you like. Does that sound good, Kathleen or Gatter?
Yeah. Yeah. Kathleen, do you have questions?
Well, I do, of course, but I'd rather open it to our participants. Should there be
Sure.
questions in the room?
Yeah. If anyone has a question, just either write down your question in chat or just unmute yourself and ask the question. And
Well, while we wait for your colleagues to chime in, of course, I always love the diversity of talks we've had. And Tom, we're so grateful for your participation today. It's evident that you are one fine ambassador of this good work and of not just yourself, but of the others that are striving for protection of grasslands. And clearly this is a critical area of importance. And it's all the more important in this time of climate crisis. So I do come from being a social psychologist, and I look at my work is on sustainable diets, and I've been commissioned by Rutledge to take up the world's definitive guide on sustainable diets. So we're looking at what we can find as the world's best evidence. So my question comes from that angle. So
Sure.
I would welcome your thoughts, Tom, on the international growing body of evidence around the health and climate co-benefits of dietary change. I recognize and the critical importance proposed here of protecting grasslands. I think that argument is well made in this video, and I know your work as well is adding to that. But if we are seeing co-benefits to environment and health and equity issues around reducing the amount of animal products and increasing plant products, similar to what the Canada Food Guide has proposed, it's kind of challenging for us to kind of counter that as well. So many reports indicate that these essential modifications are going to help us not just mitigate. I think we have to have bigger thinking as scientists. We have to do all that we can to reverse global warming and the tremendous risk if we fail to do so. And many reports say if we don't reduce the amount of animal products, we will not meet our Paris agreements. So we still have a window of opportunity to reduce the global warming, the intensity. I would really welcome your thoughts, Tom, on these opportunities we have before us.
Sure, absolutely. So I thought this might be one of the part of the question. Lots to unpack there. So what's interesting right now is, and this is quite recent. I just participated in. I don't know if you know, the UN is hosting a food summit.
I was on that call last week. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and so there's been a hosting of dialogues to submit to the summit. I participated one here, and then I was also invited for the global agenda and sustainable livestock to participate in that one just earlier this week. And of course, they're really trying to figure out how livestock production fits in a global food system and a sustainable global food system. And it certainly doesn't come without challenges. I mean, everybody agrees that climate change and, well, I shouldn't say everyone agrees, but I would agree that climate change and greenhouse gas emissions absolutely have to be addressed. And in Canada, in beef production, in other food production, it is incumbent upon us to do what we can do to reduce our impact on climate change. And so, yes, absolutely, cattle do have an impact. They produce, and raising of beef do produce greenhouse gas emissions. That is true. An initiative that was started in Canada, the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, has really started to try and tackle the actual emissions coming from cattle, either directly or through the production of, or the full life cycle production of beef, and have done life cycle analyses to try to figure out ways to improve. And so what's exciting about that is that they are, in Canada, our greenhouse gas intensity per kilogram of beef produced is actually one of the lowest in the world. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't still try and work on it. And, you know, there's a lot of improvements that could be made through the animals' dietary changes, genetics. So GATA works on this quite a bit in feed efficiency. Some cattle convert feed and what they eat much more efficiently than other cattle and produce less greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. Reducing fuel use, more efficient equipment, reducing food waste has a huge impact on our greenhouse gas emissions. We know that around the world, 20 to 30% of all food produced, including animal products, is wasted or is lost. And that's partially due to a distribution problem. Animal or food, unfortunately, has a shelf life, so that's also part of it too. But if there's ways we can reduce food waste, because all of the nutrients, I believe, are going to be important. And so when I think about North American consumption of beef and the food guide, you know, it's really interesting. I've thought about this a while, and I thought about this when I used to work for the beef industry. Was you know, how do we react to this? Because, you know, we do know that there are benefits in a diet of having meat and eggs and dairy. Within that diet, they do have beneficial nutrients, iron, vitamin B12, protein, etc. But we probably don't need to eat as much. And so really what the thought was, and we don't need to eat as much because those products are so packed in nutrients, so you don't need to overconsume them. You can reduce your consumption, still get the nutrients you need or would like, where, you know, you don't have to eat an 8-ounce steak. You could eat a 4-ounce steak. So from a nutritional aspect as well around the world, I would say there's a challenge where we could still use beef and other animal products in the diet and reduce our GHG emissions if we can get the right foods to the right people who need those nutrients or who don't need them. So that would be one way to address it. I think what the point that I wanted to bring forward with this video is that it's not really cut and dry. And so we can't just say that everyone around the world has to go vegetarian and that will solve our problems. There are impacts to every action we take. And so the challenge really is finding, you know, and that's why I like sustainability. Sustainability is a bit of a nebulous concept, but it really keeps in mind that you are trying to find the right balance of different food production or production of any product. And you're trying to do so that you aren't having severe negative impacts on something like the environment. And so when it comes to in Canada, certainly there are ways to raise cattle that are not environmentally beneficial, but there are some where it could be appropriate. And one of those places is on grasslands. And so that's where I really think it does fit. What else did you say? Oh, yes. In terms of global warming and beef's impact. So in North America, our current share of greenhouse gas emissions to how much we produce, I'll just say in Canada, but it's very similar in the US. The contribution from livestock to greenhouse gas emissions is about 3%. All of agriculture is about 7 to 8% of our total greenhouse gas emissions produced. Transportation, fossil fuels, et cetera, get up to 20, 28%. And so I really question whether the reduction in, I am being a bit contradictory here because I just said we could reduce our beef consumption, but I think what we really need to focus on are those things that really have the biggest impact first, and that's fossil fuels and energy. Not to say we shouldn't also reduce impacts to our animal or GHG emissions in our animal production or meat production. We absolutely should, but we shouldn't lose focus of what the biggest impacts will be, and that really is energy use and fossil fuels.
Yeah, that was a great answer because you touched on all of the key areas. You touched on, you know, equity issues as well as environment as well as health. And I mean, and your backdrop is just, it kind of resonates for the kind of campaign you're on, which is a beautiful one. And I support your effort. You know, it's excellent. We do, however, differ on the science. Of course, the impact of livestock is closer to 14%, and we would see, in fact, 14.5. But we would have to look together, and that could be a whole other dialogue, of course, not yourself only. There's many of us in the world who have different data sets that we're working on, but presumably we should be using the best available evidence to guide our thinking collectively, because the crisis is global and it's our children's children that will suffer the loss of these wild habitats like you're working on, along with other consequences should we fail to meet these 10-year out goals. And I'm of the mind to do everything we can to prevent it. So that's what I'm dedicating myself to. And certainly optimal diets are showing themselves to be more plant-based, and even Eat Lancet, like you suggested. They suggest, reducing the amount. If you're having beef, have it, once a month or once a week rather than the regular amount that people often take it in. So there's definitely different compositions of a diet, but we are coming to some really good collective evidence that guide us in this, and protecting our habitat is certainly a core function to that. So folks play different roles in all of this, and your contribution is appreciated.
Yeah, and the reason Nature Conservancy is thinking about, so yeah, I don't dispute the 14 global 14% or 14.5% global figure, and that's where I think we have to really think about the system where something is produced. So where I grew up, where we ranch, my great-grandfather, and at the time many people who were trying to make an agricultural living there, tried to farm, and all the soil blew away because we live in the Chinook belt and we get 100-kilometer-an-hour winds throughout the winter and throughout the fall. So soil blew away, and they figured, okay, we can't farm this because it's just not going to work. And the best use of this grassland was to raise livestock. So there are places in the world where it doesn't make environmental sense at all to raise cattle, or if you raise them poorly, it's going to have severe impacts. Absolutely, that's true. And so it really becomes a context dependent system. And I mean, the social issues as well, where a cow or a goat, a cow, a goat, and some chickens, that's what sustains a family on a small farm in many places of the world. And that is, we have to be very careful about those impacts as well. But I'll try and stick to nature, and why Nature Conservancy of Canada is looking at the grasslands, especially. And we work across Canada. We work in Atlantic Canada. There is work going on there to try and conserve very sensitive, different types of landscapes, but still landscapes that are at threat. We know that because of the loss, we have to work with ranchers to try to keep these native grasslands and ecosystems intact, and we haven't seen any other way to do that, because the loss still happens and we can't keep up. Last year, the Alberta region where I work conserved about 10,000 acres of sensitive ecosystem. That's either through donations of land, or a combination of cash investment plus land donations from mainly ranchers. But at that rate, we know that from 1991 to 2016, we lost about 3.5 million acres, or 150,000 acres of grassland per year. So we just can't keep up. And so we have to partner, and we have to collaborate on how we conserve these ecosystems, and they can still be healthy, resilient ecosystems as a working landscape. But they can't necessarily be as resilient or healthy landscape if they've been cultivated, unfortunately.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Anybody else have a question? Tom, just I have one question. I understand it's a matter of the balance between the number of the animal and the conservancy, and so then this reminds me of a project that BADI have done, I think back in 1980, and they had a different treatment, one of which was no animal, and one of them like they're trying to find out the optimal animal number on pasture. So then,
Mhm.
and the best time that we have a good amount of the good number of the animal on pasture, so then it's good for animal, also for pasture. So then you know better than I do that if we don't have animal on pasture, in the long run, we are going to lose the biodiversity. But the question is, I know somehow the answer, but I would like to get your idea and your answer like that. Is there any regulation that prevent from putting more animals on a particular landscape? You know, we're trying to say that those problem comes when we have intense number of the animal. Is there any regulation that we can prevent from putting more animal in a less land? Or
Yeah,
are
did
you
you?
planning to just, do you have heard of anything like similar to that they are proposing?
Did you ask if there's a regulation?
Yeah, regulation in place or any
Mm.
attempt to have such kind of the regulation?
Unfortunately, I don't think there is a regulation in place to that restricts you from overgrazing private land. So Crown land, of course, is protected and managed by government with a certain amount of, essentially it's a formula that's used depending on the grass type, the soil type, et cetera, the climate, that can allow for X number of animals to graze that area. And so that's pretty standard. And most ranchers do try on their own private land to figure out what that grazing intensity needs to be so that the land is not impacted negatively. Now, that's not always the case. Absolutely, there's still severe negative impacts by some people, unfortunately. And unfortunately, there aren't any regulations that I'm aware of on a land-based level. There are water regulations, there are animal welfare protection regulations, but not on a land-based level that I know of. Yeah. So when we work with a rancher, so one of the ways we work with ranchers is what we do is we buy a conservation easement. And essentially what that is that the landowner still owns their land, but we are buying rights to farm or subdivide or develop. So we're essentially buying the right and restricting them to only keep that land as a grazing scenario. So they won't be able to cultivate anymore. They won't be able to subdivide and develop, build a golf course, those types of things. And so we pay money for that, or people donate it. And then we're working with ranchers on grazing management plans. We have expertise to help figure out the right number of animals. And then we work with them to make sure that their land remains healthy and they have support to continue stewarding it. So that's one of the main things that we try and do to ensure that those landscapes remain not just intact, but healthy at the same time. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else, if there's any question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
For Tom, or actually anybody with expertise in this. Earlier we were talking a bit about carbon sequestration. The video definitely highlights that and the cattle's impact. But yeah, how does a perennial system with cattle on it, whether it be the grasslands in Alberta or Saskatchewan, or marginal land in Ontario or marginal land in the Maritime provinces, how does the carbon budget there with cattle on it compare to the protein alternatives like a field of chickpeas or a field of lentils? Because of oftentimes a lot of nitrogen fertilizer use, which is really a very energy intensive process. Are cattle sequestering more, I guess, than the chickpea fields and the lentil fields?
It's a really good question, and it's it's going to depend. And I don't have the data at the top of my head, but but we do know, and this is some great work from our Gatter's old colleagues at U of A, Ed Bork, and others in the Rangeland Research Institute have studied the carbon sequestration and carbon loss from from certain land use impacts farming, mainly farming or grazing scenarios. And what they found was, so really if you've got a healthy intact grassland, you're at equilibrium. So carbon is there, what's taken off in grazing gets sequestered back in the ground as roots and plant growth grows. So there's an equilibrium cycle going. Once that land is converted, Ed Bork has shown that depending on the soil type and how much carbon is stored in the soil, so that's also quite variable. So some marginal soils will store 50 tons per acre or per hectare. Really rich soils will store up to 200 tons per acre. So like in Ontario, and that's why people farm them, because they're so rich, right? So they're so rich in nutrients. And that's, that's partly the main reason why most lands that are cultivated today is because of those rich soils. So, but what he has found is that the minute you turn over, you cultivate that native grassland, you lose 30 to 50% of that stored carbon in the first year. So what happens then is, through some good farming practices and different plant varieties, I don't know how much lentils would sequester carbon and other nutrients more so than other plants, but you can start to rebuild some of that carbon. Annual cropping can only go so far. No-till farming methods certainly help to continue that sequestration process, but it will take quite a bit of time to replace. If it's a 200 ton of carbon soil or a type of soil, it's going to take quite a long time to replenish the 100 tons back into the soil that you've lost if it was indeed 50%. Through grazing, so once you turn that soil back into perennial forage, that's really where you start to get a lot of that carbon coming back into the soil. And it usually takes about 30 years to get back to your original equilibrium. That's a general rule. Again, it really depends on what you've planted back, what is being used to create that ground cover and start to rebuild that carbon in the soil. So it may not exactly answer your question, but it does. And I don't know how the loss of carbon is factored into your overall GHG equivalent number that you get if you're comparing beef to lentils. I don't know how it's all factored in on that one.
Yeah. Oh no, that's a great answer. Yeah, because oftentimes, people say, oh, lentils, chickpeas, almonds are the next best thing to meat, and it gives you that same protein source, which it does. But I've always been curious as to know, okay, well, in a carbon budget sense, how does it compare? Right.
Yeah, and there's research ongoing right now in Canada. U of A, University of Manitoba, really trying to understand that better. And in fact, they're even also trying to figure out, not just on a kilogram of food basis, which is what many of these have been tried to compare on, but from a nutrient basis. So protein equivalent of, what's in a kilogram of chickpeas versus a kilogram of other product, beef or other grains or other vegetables. So they're trying to even go to the nutrient basis for impact. And that even gets a little bit more complex and hard to decide. So but what I think is really important is all these can be complementary. You can complement farming and livestock systems. I don't want to vilify farming because we absolutely need those crops. But we can work on a complementary system. And even, we used to have mixed farms where we had farming and cattle. You take the crop off and then you put the cows out and they would graze the stubble and residue that's left over. They would fertilize the ground at the same time. And you can, there's also research looking at those complementary systems where you can sometimes get a crop of lentils after it's been, maybe a complementary plant has been grown quickly and grazed, and then the rest comes up and then you get that crop off. So I think there's those types of opportunities, which to me really I think are promising, because then you're really optimizing that land use really, really quite well.
Yeah, like intercropping, I guess. Like planting
Exactly.
one after the other.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very neat. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I guess another question for you, with the Nature Conservancy and even your ranch or other ranchers in your area, has the integration of other livestock animals, such as like chickens and chicken tractors, kind of being moved behind the cattle, similar to what migratory birds might have done following the bison? Has that been something that you guys have talked about on your ranch or even in the Nature Conservancy?
We've never talked about it at the Nature Conservancy. So, you know, we try at the Nature Conservancy itself, we try, partly the reason I know a lot about the beef industry is I grew up in it and then I worked for it. So, so that's part of it. But no, we really try to stay out of those systems. Like our goal is like, keep the land intact first, and then we'll help with stewardship and other stuff later. And then the production of what people want to graze or how they do it. I mean, we do have some expertise in that area, but not a lot. On our ranch, no, I mean, my brother's always thought about how to get free range chickens out there following cows around, but never has had the time to do it. I know there are people that have worked on those types of systems. They're really, really interesting systems to try to integrate other types of livestock together. Sheep and cattle graze differently. So a lot of people will have a herd of sheep and cattle to get a different mix of grazing on the landscape. I just met on one of these panels I was on a couple weeks ago on these food system dialogues. There's a woman from Ontario who had an orchard, and she was really, you know, they would mow beneath the orchard, mow all that grass and prevent weeds from coming up, and that she really felt was a waste. So she bought sheep, and now the sheep graze everything underneath the orchard, and she gets sort of two production systems going on the same property with and a bunch of fertilizer at the same time. So yeah, kind of cool creativity to think of these different types of complementary things you can do on the same land base that you've got. We have a lot of crop residues, discarded potatoes, you know, other production that go into cattle that are fed to cattle. Cattle will eat it. Like a lot of stuff that's discarded from the human food system goes to cattle. That's another benefit. It's instead of composted. I mean, composted isn't waste, but running it through a cow sometimes is you're still able to use that as a feed source. So that happens as well.
Yeah, it turns it into a compost that you can use more quickly than
yes, yeah. A more processed or refined compost, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and now we have on chat from Ashley. Excellent session, and she's just commenting, not maybe I don't see the questions. She says that I think that's also important to consider what makes sense to the region when thinking about what's sustainable use of the land. So then it's kind of echoing the point that the region use also is important, and we are talking about the sustainability. Okay. Any other question from audience? Okay. Looks like there's no more question. And thanks again, Tom, for your time. And we really appreciate that. Was great. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining today's session, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, thanks for having me, Kader. And great questions, everyone. Really good.
Yeah, great session. Great to have you two join. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Alex, and
Thanks.
Guy and others.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Have a great day.